Okej, då kör vi. Ja, välkomna till denna kväll i ABF-huset här i Stockholm. Jag heter Sundgren och är ordförande för stiftelsen Jämlikhetsfonden, som är en av arrangörerna. Programmet ikväll är mycket enkelt. Vi är här för att lyssna på Richard Wilkinson och den nyutkomna boken Den inre ojämlikheten, The Inner Level, som han kommer att presentera för oss här ikväll. Och det är ju en uppföljare till den förra boken, Jämlikhetsanden, som presenterades i den här salen 2010. Och då var det också fullspikat. Arrangörerna för det här evenemanget, det är ABF här i Stockholm. Det är Jämlikhetsfonden då, som jag är ordförande för. Det är tankesmedjan Katalys med Daniel Suhonen. Det är Landsorganisationen. Och vi bör ju självklart också nämna förlaget Karneval, som har tagit initiativet till att ta hit Richard Wilkinson hit till Stockholm med Björn Eklund i spetsen. Och ni har sett att ni kan köpa böcker här utanför. Temat för kvällen är jämlikhet. Och jag kan väl då säga att den stiftelse, Jämlikhetsfonden, som jag tog initiativet till, den startade 2015. Och då hade jag förstås läst Jämlikhetsanden. Men det är också så att jämlikhet är lite grann hjärtat, den röda tråden i den politiska inställning som jag tycker är viktig. Och vi har nu delat ut ett pris några år. Och den första debattartikel i DN som Daniel Suhonen och jag skrev tillsammans, den hade ett krav på den dåvarande regeringen. Och det var att den skulle tillsätta en jämlikhetskommission. Det tog några år, men en månad före valet nu senast så tillsatte regeringen Jämlikhetskommissionen. Det hade varit bättre om det hade skett i början. Men nu finns kommissionen med Per Molander som ordförande och den arbetar. Och det ska bli intressant att se vad den kommer fram till. En annan aktör på det här området är självklart Landsorganisationen. Och även Landsorganisationen, LO, har alltså tillsatt en jämlikhetsutredning. Och projektledare för den utredningen, det är Marika Lindgren Åsbrink. Och hon ska alldeles snart komma upp här. Men låt mig ändå denna dag, när så mycket händer här i Sverige på det politiska området och i världen faktiskt, fundera över en Novusundersökning som Jämlikhetsfonden tog initiativ till. Vi frågade alltså svenska väljare vilken inställning de hade till jämlikhet, ekonomisk jämlikhet. Och det visade sig att 4 av 5 svenska väljare ansåg att det var en viktig regeringsuppgift att minska de ekonomiska klyftorna. Tänk på det, 4 av 5 svenskar. Men nu har vi fått ett regeringsprogram som kraftigt omfördelar till höginkomsttagare och som går på tvärs mot vad svenska väljare faktiskt säger att de tycker. Och det är ju egentligen lite märkligt, för att inom alla riksdagspartier fanns det en majoritet av deras väljare som ansåg att man borde minska klyftorna, de ekonomiska klyftorna i det här samhället. Ja, det kan vi fundera på ikväll. Och med detta så vill jag hälsa Marika Lindgren Åsbrink från Landsorganisationen upp hit. Ja, Marika, jag har läst en del av de här rapporterna som den utredning du leder har presenterat. Och särskilt den här som tar upp 6 punkter som är viktiga för att vi ska få ett jämlikare Sverige. Vad skulle du säga är den viktigaste åtgärden som vi kan genomföra i Sverige för att minska klyftorna?
Det var en lurig fråga, för jag tror att själva poängen är att det är väldigt många olika faktorer som behöver göras. Jämlikhetsutredningen har hittills släppt 2 program och båda ska finnas här ute som man kan ta. Den ena handlar om skolan, en väldigt viktig förutsättning naturligtvis, en väldigt viktig möjlighet för att utjämna livschanser som tyvärr inte funkar så bra som det skulle kunna göra. Och det andra är ett program för omfördelning som handlar om kanske det man oftast tänker lite mer klassisk liksom ekonomisk fördelningspolitik. Det är naturligtvis en väldigt viktig fråga, men det är inte den enda frågan som handlar om jämlikhet. Den svenska modellen för ändå en relativt sett hög jämlikhet bygger ju både på ekonomisk omfördelning men också väldigt mycket annat. En stark välfärdsstat, en stark facklig organisering som förhindrar att inkomstskillnader överhuvudtaget uppkommer. Liksom. Så man behöver titta på flera olika områden.
Jag konstaterar att i den där utredningens förslag så tar ni upp det som ryms på skatteområdet då, och ni kan ju tänka er fastighetsskatt, progressiv om jag minns rätt, arvsskatt. Hur ska vi få igenom det?
Ja, alltså det finns ju skrivningar om en skattereform som ändå på något sätt ska öka jämlikheten, eller hur nu är formulerat i det här underlaget för en regeringsöverenskommelse. Men det är ju ändå så att de konkreta förslag som ligger i överenskommelsen är ju kraftigt omfördelande åt fel håll. Det är ju väldigt uppenbart att det är så. Så att det återstår väl ganska mycket jobb, kan man säga.
Ja, kommer LO att agera nu då? Hur får vi fart på de fackliga organisationerna så att vi får ett tryck för det här? Har du någon tanke om det?
Ja, det är väl en lite större fråga än vad jag kan svara på. Men det är klart att facket är oerhört centralt. Har alltid varit, kommer alltid vara. Det finns också starka forskningsbelägg för att just facket spelar väldigt stor roll för graden av jämlikhet. Och det tycker jag är intressant i dessa tider när ändå väldigt många människor och institutioner som annars kanske inte tidigare har brytt sig så mycket om ojämlikhet faktiskt börjar bli oroliga för att ojämlikheten ökar så mycket i världen inom länder. Och liksom letar efter vad kan vi göra åt det. Och just liksom den fackliga organiseringen och den fackliga styrkan är någonting som det finns liksom väldigt starka bevis för att det verkligen bidrar till ökad jämlikhet. Så det är väldigt enkelt att dra slutsatsen att man policymässigt ska underlätta för facket och för löntagarnas förhandlingsstyrka, så kan man få bättre jämlikhet. Och
då kan jag bara säga att det bekräftas ju av boken Den inre ojämlikheten. Här finns tabeller som visar det, att där facket är starkt är jämlikheten bättre än där facket är svagt. Där ökar klyftorna. Ja, Marika, du har fått svara på några frågor, men det är inte du som är huvudpersonen ikväll, utan du ska nu få äran att presentera Richard Wilkinson. Och Richard, welcome up on the stage.
Thank you. Let me be very brief and just allow me to introduce our distinguished guest here tonight, author with Kate Pickett of The Inner Level, den inre ojämlikheten, and The Spirit Level, Jämlikhetsanden. Please give a very warm welcome to Professor Richard Wilkinson.
They've already done that. Thank you. Marika, I don't know what you are saying. You may have been disagreeing with all our work. I'm sorry you all have to understand English instead of me learning Swedish. It would have been more efficient for me to learn Swedish, so I'm sorry. Well, it's lovely every time I visit Sweden. I like coming here. The only worry I have is that since our Spirit Level book came out in Sweden, you have become rapidly more unequal. And I hope that this book doesn't add to that. I don't think writing books changes the world. Maybe it helps a little bit, but not very much. Right, I'm going to go through some of what's in this new book of ours, which builds on the spirit level. The spirit level, remember, showed that almost all the problems which have social gradients, all the problems that are more common at the bottom of society, get worse with more inequality. A very simple relationship. Basically, it's saying that problems which we know are related to social status get worse when you increase the status differentials. The only surprise is it doesn't just get worse for the poor. The biggest effects are on the poor, but the vast majority of the population would do better in a more equal society. Many of the problems we dealt with in the spirit level are problems that involve behavior, violence, teenage births, imprisonment, which tell us in a way that inequality does something to what's going on in our heads. It changes our behavior. And so this new book is an attempt to take that further. It's also an attempt to, I think, make people, try and get people to see that inequality affects them intimately. So you might not be involved in prisons and violence and teenage births and things like that. I think most people think that their world is a little intimate circle of close friends and relations, their family, and that's all that matters. What goes on out there in society doesn't really matter. So what we're trying to show in this book is how intimately our thoughts and feelings and our sense of self-worth is affected by inequality. I mean, fundamental to the story I'm going to tell you is that inequality makes status and class more important. It makes it a more powerful determinant of what happens to us, and not only as shown by everything in the spirit level, getting all those things getting worse, all those things with social gradients, but also a number of other indicators. For instance, the likelihood that you are married to somebody from a different social class reduces with more inequality. You're more likely to marry into your own social class. Residential segregation of rich and poor increases. Social mobility declines. So we have lots of evidence that class and status become more important. And the effect we're really dealing with is the way that that affects our judgment of each other. You know, the idea of each person's worth, if you like. We judge their personal, internal worth from their external position and wealth. But also, we worry about how other people judge us in the same sort of way. So that's really the central issue. I want, though, to start with this sort of very odd view of how we present ourselves. The top picture is how we present ourselves on Facebook, or if you're having your photograph taken. I've had some photographs taken today, and in every one of them I smile as if everything was wonderful. If you take pictures of people when they don't know they're being photographed, then they look like they do in that lower picture. And I think this mismatch between what our lives are really like and how we present ourselves is also underlined by data. I've just been shown data showing the rise in mental illness in Sweden over the last generation or so, since I think around 1990. the self-reported stress, I think, amongst young people is 4 times as high as it was. And although you might say self-reported stress isn't a very sound or secure measure, it tells us something about what people are feeling subjectively. But in Britain a few months ago, we had a report from the Mental Health Foundation, and it said that nearly 3/4 of adults in Britain felt so stressed that they were overwhelmed and unable to cope sometime in the past year. Half that number, well, 1/3 of the population, had had suicidal feelings as a result of stress, and 16% had actually self-harmed. This is in a society where living standards are almost as high as they've ever been, historically completely unprecedented. And this level of psychosocial pain, if you like, we don't understand what's going on. And when these news reports came out from this Mental Health Foundation survey, the media asked for more psychiatry, more mental health services, counseling, and so on. And though we need that, even more important is to understand what the world is doing to us that is making these problems worse. And I think that extraordinary little work has been done on that. Although there are signs of fringe groups in psychology and mental health who are beginning to think about the general structural social determinants of mental health. So not just at the individual factors that make life harder for one person than another, but the way in which the social environment can make things more difficult for all of us. I think that in a way there's a sort of naive view of inequality that is the most common view, that it only matters if it creates poverty, a sort of material understanding. I think that socialists in the past thought that inequality mattered because so many people in the 1930s were living in terrible conditions, and then it was wrong that other people should be in great luxury. But now the bottom 10 or 20% of our populations, most of them have flat screen televisions, they all have fridge freezers and so on. I think some politicians, particularly Tony Blair in the UK, started to think that inequality doesn't matter. What they were failing to see, failing to understand, is the psychosocial effects of inequality. More to do with dominance and subordination, feelings of superiority and inferiority, that we are extraordinarily sensitive to. I think in a way what we're dealing with is not, in talking about income differences or wealth differences if we had more data, is not separate from class and status. As I say, class and status is made more important. It strengthens its grip on us in more unequal society. I think really what we're discussing is whether our social pyramids are very steep ones like that or much shallower ones like that. And of course we use our money a lot of the time to express social status differences in all sorts of ways. The kind of car you drive, the clothing, the aesthetic taste, what entertainments, what books you read, you know, all class differentiated in so many ways. I'm just going to remind you of a few of the results from our inner level book, from our spirit level book. Remember, we had this data from the early 2000s on the scale of the gap between the richest and poorest 10%, 20% in each society. And then the gap was, amongst the more equal countries, the top 20% were getting 3.5 or 4 times as much as the bottom 20%. And in some other countries, including the UK, USA, and Portugal, the gap was twice as big. In most of those countries, inequality has got worse since then. There have been a few changes in position. Portugal has had quite rapid reductions in inequality. I think in France there's been very little rise, in the Netherlands rather little rise, but in most of the other countries things have got worse. And you remember probably our index of health and social problems, where we put data on a whole lot of different problems with social gradients together and show that the more unequal countries do worse. And because we were worried that people would think we'd just chosen data or outcomes to suit our argument, we also looked at measures of child well-being put together by UNICEF, which show exactly the same thing. There are, I think, about 40 different components of this index of child well-being. So, you know, whether children have books at home, whether they feel they can talk to their parents, and what immunization rates are like, whether there's bullying in schools, all that goes into it. But I wanted to show it to you again, partly because we also have data on changes in inequality and changes in child well-being, which shows that, well, let me explain this graph. Along the bottom, you've got the increases or decreases in inequality. That 0 in the middle is no change in inequality. And along the vertical axis, you've got rises or falls in child well-being. So you see Sweden on the extreme right there. Because you've had rises in inequality, you've had falls in child well-being. And Sweden's position is very much as we'd expect from the inequality data. Although it's not a close fit, just looking at changes over no more than 10 years, it's statistically a significant fit. As I think probably most of you know the spirit level stuff, I'm going to skip over a few things, but you remember imprisonment is strongly related to inequalities, so is school bullying, enormous differences. You see this is the proportion of 11-year-olds who bullied others at least twice in the last couple of months. No, in the last month. And you can see in the more equal countries on the left, that was 2 or 3%. But in the more unequal countries, it rises to perhaps 20%. So huge differences in bullying. And as you probably know, I do emphasize that this has to do with our evolved psychology. I mean, a dominance hierarchy in monkeys is a bullying hierarchy. It's based on strength. The chief baboon is the strongest, and the one at the bottom is the weakest. And any uncertainty about rank position in the rank hierarchy is sorted out by a trial of strength. So I do think that there is a profound connection between bullying and dominance hierarchies. I very much wish we had internationally comparable data on bullying between adults, but we don't have that. And quite a few of the measures we had in inequality, in the spirit level, have been explored by other people, amplified, shown on larger numbers of countries, including this one and including this one on social mobility, showing that more unequal countries have less social mobility. So you can't justify inequality by saying it's fair because people who work hard get to the top and the people who don't go down. There is less social movement. As I said, class becomes a more powerful determinant of outcomes. I want now to move on from there and first to read you a quote from a study which shows that we are dealing with the effects of social status differentiation itself, that material possessions are important not directly because of what they do to you in a material sense, but because of where they place you in society. You know, you live in the right part of town and you drive the right kind of car and all the rest of it as a way of communicating your social status. The study I'm going to read you from the Journal of Social Policy interviewed people in poverty in 7 different countries, I think 7, in Uganda, in India, in China, Pakistan, Korea, the United Kingdom, and Norway. So it's talked to people in poverty in some poor countries and some richer ones. And material conditions in those different societies, you know, poverty in Norway means living in perhaps one of the flats on the left-hand side. Poverty in India might be living in the picture on the right. But what was important about this study is the subjective experience of poverty in those very different material conditions was very similar. So the study, this is the quote from the study, respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children, despite respondents generally believing that they'd done their best against all odds. They mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. And this internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officials. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. And it's in that sense that possessions are important as a source of a way into social acceptance. No parent was able to escape the shame of failing to provide for their children, even when children were prepared to stop asking for things. For men, relying on others or on welfare benefits was perceived as a challenge to their sense of masculinity. A British father to 2 children admitted, "I feel like shit. I'm the man in this relationship. I'm meant to be the man to take care of the missus and my kids, and I don't." I think that is really important in showing that what is really upsetting, subjectively important, is being at the bottom of the social ladder, being seen as a failure, being seen as disrespected and shamed as low social status, even more powerful than some of the material effects. And, you know, this isn't just about poverty. It's all about the extent to which people feel valued. And of course, the advertisers know this very, very well. I really hate these L'Oreal advertisements. And when I say it's not just about poverty, we now have studies which are able to compare levels of status anxiety, your worries about how you're seen and judged, what people think of you, in more and less equal countries. So this graph shows along the bottom there are the different income groups. So on the left you've got the poorest 10th of the population, and on the right you've got the richest 10th of the population. And those 3 lines are on top the most unequal societies, and on the bottom the more equal ones. And you see levels of status anxiety are not the highest amongst the poor on the left, all the way through in all income groups, they're higher in the more unequal societies. So as I say, we all worry more about status. That undermines our sense of self-worth. Psychological studies have shown again and again, I mean really hundreds of them, that the kind of worries that affect levels of stress hormones, cortisol principally, are studies that are situations that expose us to what they call social evaluative threat. That is the judgments other people might make of us. Threats to self-esteem or social status, where others can judge your performance. That's almost a word-for-word quote from a meta-analysis of, I think, 208 studies looking at how stress responds to being given different tasks to do. And that feeds into mental illness. We've known about this since the spirit level when we produced that graph, showing higher levels of mental illness in more unequal countries. But we now, through a paper of Sherry Johnson, a psychologist in the United States, and her colleagues, know how that feeds into mental illness. She has a paper on the dominance behavioral system, which is a part of our brain which we share and we have in common with, I think, most mammals and some even non-mammalian species, which deals with issues to do with dominance and subordination. You have to, if you're in a monkey dominance hierarchy, you have to know where you come. You have to know whether you're superior or inferior to others. You have to know how to behave in relation to dominance and otherwise, I mean, if you get it wrong, you get beaten up, and the low-status animals have many more bite marks. But what Sherry Johnson did was review an enormous literature on mental illness and personality disorders and show how many of them were involved in issues to do with status. I mean, either accepting your inferiority, feeling you're useless, you're no good, lack of confidence, low self-esteem, or maybe feeling that you're fighting that all the time, that people are always trying to put you down, and that your life is about sort of maintaining some kind of dignity against that, how you're seeing things. And then people who just assume their superiority. They feel born into it, they're superior beings and so on, and others who are endlessly struggling for it. And we show there are two different, well, she went through these different mental illnesses and suggested which ones were related to these issues. I got in touch with her and said, and she thought that most societies had very similar social hierarchies. And I got in touch with her and said, we think that societies with bigger income differences have steeper social hierarchies, that these issues will trigger the kind of mental health problems you're dealing with more often. And our impression was that there are two different responses to being more worried about how you're seen and judged. You can either, as I said, lose confidence, find social contact too stressful, you withdraw from social life and feel depressed, as I said, low self-esteem and so on. These sort of, what's summed up, I suppose, in this little picture. And I'm sure you know, probably each of you, young people who feel like this, who are worried, dissatisfied with what they look like and what other people think of them, and find all these social judgments extremely difficult. And then there's also this response of being narcissistic. I want to read you actually a few of the comments of people writing about their fears and anxieties about these social judgments people who are suffering social anxiety, they are the extreme case, but I think you can understand how these problems are increased for all of us. So let me just read a few of these little clips that come from a website where people can share their experiences anonymously. One of them says, "In social situations, I shut down. I tend to be awkward because I'm scared of people judging me and not liking me, so much that I distance myself. I hear people laughing, and I immediately think they're laughing at me, which is stupid, but I can't help it. Over the years, I've learned to embrace the loner lifestyle." Someone else says, "Sometimes I avoid everyone and anyone because I can't stand the thought of them judging me. I have panic attacks over something as simple as going to the checkout at Walmart. I do self-checkouts so that I don't have to talk to anyone." And the last one, "I'm extremely shy around both people I know and don't know. It hinders my everyday life so much that people think I'm making it up. I have no friends. It's hard for me to go anywhere. I always make sure I go shopping in the day. That way I can wear glasses or a hat. It's my security blanket from social anxiety disorder. I get tongue-tied and sweaty. Then I feel like they're looking at me, like I'm some sort of freak. It's a living hell I struggle with on a daily basis." Now, although only a small minority of the population have things as serious as that, we all know the sense of social awkwardness, the embarrassment that we encounter in so many daily meetings. I suspect these anxieties, our worries about how we're seen and judged, are sufficiently stressful to be one of the really important explanations of why community life diminishes in more unequal societies, why people trust each other less, and know their neighbors less, are less public-spirited, and so on. We show, in the light of Sherry Johnson's paper on the dominance behavioral system, that depression is more common in more unequal societies. There are now about 3 studies showing that. This is in American states, showing higher levels of depression in the more unequal states. But also the opposite effect. The narcissism, the self-enhancement. This is based on international interviews, a team of psychologists interviewing people in different countries, where they ask them, how do you think you compare with the average in your country? And they ask them on a number of different dimensions. So do you think you're more attractive than most Swedes? Do you feel you're more intelligent? And you probably know the joke about, I think 90% of Americans think they're better drivers than average. I think in Sweden it's something near 60% of you think you're better drivers than average. Closer than the Americans, but still a bit on the high side. And you see here this kind of self-enhancement, this, instead of being modest about your achievements and abilities, you do the opposite. And of course, it, like the depression and low self-esteem, is a response to our worries about how we're seen and judged. And we also have, there's a paper now showing that schizophrenia is more common. I would be very surprised if bipolar disorder isn't more common, because in a way people are cycling between being optimistic about social status and being very energetic, and on the other hand feeling they're useless. We also did a paper on psychotic symptoms, which are more common it turns out, are more common in more unequal societies. So we're beginning to have an understanding of how bigger material differences feed into the psychological well-being of our societies, and probably contribute to the increasing evidence that things are going wrong in that field. it's really important because studies of happiness and studies of health show that absolutely crucial are issues to do with the quality of our social relationships. What your relationships are like, how many friends you have, whether you're involved in community life. You know, this is what happiness, satisfaction with life, sense of well-being is really based on. And you see it particularly clearly in the health evidence. A meta-analysis of 150 studies looking at the connection between inequality and friendship found that whether or not you have a larger or smaller group of friends is at least as important, perhaps marginally more important, than whether or not you smoke to your survival in a follow-up period. Not just shown by big observational studies, but also experiments where they expose you to infection, to the common cold, or look at the speed of wound healing, and you find that people with more friends are less vulnerable to these infections and their wounds heal more quickly. And it's really quite remarkable, the connection between the quality of and involvement in social relations and happiness and well-being. And of course, in our societies, we've got to the end of what economic growth can do for happiness and well-being. And, you know, it is what's transformed our lives, but it no longer seems to be an important determinant of societal well-being. And of course, with that self-enhancement, another way we self-enhance that's really important in terms of thinking about how we're going to deal with carbon emissions and downsize in terms of economic growth is the evidence that inequality adds to, I've shown you it adds to status anxiety and status competition, but one of the ways it expresses itself is if you're in a more unequal society, consumerism is intensified. Studies showing you're more likely to spend your money on a flashy car if you live in a more unequal society, and that you're more likely, these studies are both of the American states and internationally, you're more likely to spend money on status clothing and with the right labels and so on. And how important these processes are, I think, is shown by this graph. I'm afraid this is American data, but you see there the dotted blue line is the rise in inequality, and you see debt following it up. So, you know, this sense of having to keep up with other people, taking out loans and increasing mortgages to maintain expenditure, all that increases. And there are lots of links that we deal with in the end chapters of the links between the need to move towards environmental sustainability and how greater equality makes that easier. I want now just to say a few words about how the causality works in very basic sense. In public health, looking at health inequalities, we became aware that social status matters in itself. We learned that from experiments on monkeys as well as observational studies on human beings. We always initially thought that social status was a proxy for the real things that matter behind social status, levels of consumption and living conditions and so on. But now we know that social position itself is important. And as I said, friendship. And of course, they are the two different ways human beings can come together. Either we're living in a society where the strong get everything, based on power and coercion. Think of animal hierarchies, privileged access to resources. Or, on the other hand, we can come together on the basis of friendship, which is about mutuality, reciprocity, social obligations, sharing, and a recognition of each other's needs. And so, in a sense, what we're dealing with, and what we were so surprised to find when studying population health differences, was the importance of these two different contrasting forms of social relationship. And of course, the nature of social relationships has always been crucial to human well-being. And you find this still in our language, that words like companion in different European languages, I'm afraid I don't know about Swedish, it's really about sharing resources. It's about sharing access to food and necessities. And you still see this in the religious symbolism of the communion service. It's about sharing, though I think most Christians have sort of forgotten what it's symbolic of. I shouldn't perhaps say most, but many. You see it also in the way in which we eat together. We eat together because it's really important not to dispute access to necessities, but that leads to every kind of violence. And Marshall Sahlins, an American anthropologist I very much admire, who spent his career studying hunting and gathering societies, which of course were very egalitarian and based on gift exchange and food sharing. He said, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. How I show you that I'm not going to fight you for access to necessities, the gift says that in very concrete terms. It's a very clear symbol that I recognize your need. And as I said, for human well-being, whether we're sharing or having to fight each other for everything is so crucial. We shouldn't think of ourselves as hardwired for one kind of behavior rather than another. For 90% of our existence as anatomically modern human beings with brains the current size, we lived in extraordinarily egalitarian societies of the kind that Marshall Sahlins was talking about. But we have an older inheritance, which we have a chapter on, the sort of dominance hierarchies that belong to our pre-human existence. So we have social strategies from this hunting and gathering period of prehistory, as well as dominant strategies from our pre-human existence. It's almost as if we had two different human natures. We use both sets of social strategy all the time. We know how to make friends and how to treat friends, how to behave, we know the egalitarian behavior that friendship depends on. We also know how to be snobbish and socially climbing and show ourselves as better and so on. We use both those strategies. But the balance between them, how much we use one and how much we use the other, seems powerfully influenced by the kind of society we live in. Not only as we become aware of it, whether through school bullying or in early adulthood as you come on the labor market and find maybe high unemployment and pretty nasty low-paid jobs, but also through epigenetic influences. We now know that the quality of the social environment, the subjective social environment in early childhood, switches genes on and off. It doesn't change your genetic structure, but it changes the way your genes behave. And it looks as if there are processes in early childhood that prepare you either for dealing with a society where you have to watch your back, learn not to trust others because we're all rivals, fight for what you can get, or on the other hand, prepare us for a society where we have to have more empathy, where we depend on cooperation, on reciprocity, and be good at those sort of things. So kids with a very tough upbringing are not just damaged, they are in a sense prepared for a different kind of social reality. I think that's really important. Our book deals with all sorts of other things. As I said, it deals with the need for bringing together these things to do with equality and moving towards sustainability. It also deals with the evolutionary origins of these different social strategies. It deals also with what I think is the widest misunderstanding of the way the social hierarchy works. The belief that we have a social hierarchy because some people are genetically better than others. And, you know, the people at the top think they're a superior race. They're cleverer than all the rest of us and so on. And the people at the bottom often believe that they're there because they're no good. And as I read in that quote, people experience school as a system of social grading. But now we know more about the malleability of the human mind in childhood. We know the effects of poverty and social status on brain development through brain scanning and much better understanding of the influence of these different things. It's clear that the differences in ability we see in the population are much more a reflection of where you are in the social hierarchy than a determinant of where you get to. So the causality, people have misunderstood which way it goes. We go through that in some detail. Because in a sense we are dealing, as I said, with issues to do with how people are valued. Now, inequality. You probably can't see this. The top line, along the bottom is from 1900 to 2015. That little blue line at the top is the share of society's income going to the top decile of the population. The important line to look at is the green one, the overall income inequality, and you see it was coming down until around 1980, and then you've had the modern rise of inequality, which is an international pattern. So although you might think you cease to be one of the more equal countries, your position relative to others is, you know, you're still better than most of our societies. So the international pattern looks something like this. I think that is largely a reflection of the growth and then the weakening of social democratic parties, of trade unions, of the whole labor movement in society. You know, it grew from and pushed income differences down from sometime in the 1930s until the late 1970s. And then with the weakening of the socialist movement, the weakening of trade unions, the growth of neoliberal thinking, you get a new international ideology. And interestingly, all these ideologies do seem to be international. You know, even the 1848 revolutions occurred all over the world. The 1960s was a radical decade everywhere. The 1980s was a right-wing decade, and so it's continued. My argument that this is primarily about the strength of the labor movement and fear of communism is based on graphs I've seen now for half a dozen countries. This is for the United States. Along the bottom, you've got dates from 1918 to 2008. that top line is the share of income going to the richest 10% in the United States. The blue line at the bottom is the proportion of the labor force in trade unions. I don't think that's because trade unions transform our wages. They're helpful. I think it's because trade union strength is a good indication of the strength of the whole labor movement. That idea of a countervailing voice. How often in the media there are people who can put forward a developed perspective about a different way of running society. Before I finish, and of course, the rise in inequality is largely the rich running away from the rest of us, and they justify it by saying that they're good for company performance and so on. I'm rather proud to have found the next graph before it was published in The Economist and the Wall Street Journal. But what it shows is shareholder returns on the vertical axis, how much shareholders are getting, over a 10-year period from 2006. And it divides the CEOs at the top by whether they're earning more than the average CEO pay. This is the largest 429 companies in the US. The top line shows the shareholder returns of the less well-paid CEOs. So their companies actually do better. It looks as if it's damaging for CEOs to get so much. The bottom line is the ones that are paid less than most of them. We have recently, well, over the last 5 or 10 years, had economists at last coming round to saying that inequality is not good for economic growth, even if we did want economic growth in the rich world. So OECD and the World Bank have said that it's bad for sustained economic growth. It leads to inequality, leads to more booms and slumps. We mentioned, we looked up soon after we published The Spirit Level, when we were challenged by people saying, surely inequality is a spur to initiative, creativity, effort, all that kind of thing. We thought, well, how can we measure that? And we thought maybe patents per head of population. You know, if you invent something, you get a patent out. We found that patents were marginally more common per head of population in more equal societies. But since then, a Korean colleague has looked at it more carefully amongst a larger number of countries. And this is patents per head of population. And you see a very clear tendency for fewer patents in the more unequal countries on the right. And that fits very much with what we know about not only mental illness that I've been talking about, but lower levels of child educational performance, more drug abuse, more alcohol, more people in prison, lower social mobility. It's quite clear that more unequal societies are wasting their talent. So even if you're going to drop the human arguments and just think about the economic returns, you should be thinking about that. I think I've probably used more than my time, so I should stop. But basically, you can reduce income differences before tax or after tax, and we think that the most fundamental way of reducing inequality is through all forms of economic democracy, a program for growing employee representation on company boards, and also incentives to cooperatives and employee-owned companies. You know, I do think the next big transformation in human well-being, and human emancipation, if you like, has got to be extending democracy into the economy. We know those things work well. There are lots of examples and studies of more democratic models of companies that seem to work better, even in terms of productivity. I've recently had the pleasure of going to Mondragon and giving a lecture there, which is the biggest group of cooperatives in the world. It's in the Basque region of Spain. And just in case, and people sometimes say, "Ooh, you know, correlation doesn't prove causality." And we sometimes pretend to have, doesn't it? As if we were never thought of it. And actually, the thing is, there's just so much research. We show the very simplest picture to get the widest possible understanding, knowing that there are really sophisticated statistical models in the research literature, simply hundreds of papers, and we've looked at that wide body of literature, examining it against the criteria for causality of these relationships, and we've also spelt out, again in the academic literature, the psychosocial processes behind the data I've been showing you. So I finished. I'm sorry to spend so long. I've overrun.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. It gave us, all of us, very much to think about. But as you mentioned, your book covers even more, so I recommend all of you to read it. I have a few questions.
Can I actually say first, I'd like to thank Bjorn Eklund for publishing our books and making sure they get some public exposure. There's no point in doing research without that. He's been such a good person to work with.
Yes. I would like to actually start with a somewhat boring and technical question to what you just mentioned, the relation between correlation or causality. Well, you mentioned that there is plenty of research to show the causation, and you also mentioned the psychosocial processes behind this mechanism. Could you like just briefly explain what is it about inequality that creates this wide range of, homicide rates, teenage pregnancy, recycling, all these?
There are slightly different causal processes in each case. In this new book, we're trying to explain what we think are the central ones to do with the increasing importance of status and so on, and the invidious social comparisons, all those, the way it undermines your sense of self-worth and makes social contact more difficult. But you see, in something like violence, how that fits in is very clear, that violence becomes more common. The trigger to violence is so often loss of face, humiliation, disrespect. There's one way I can make you respect me, if I haven't got the status in other ways. And in a society where status becomes more common, more important, people, particularly at the bottom, feel more worried about how they're seen and judged. And if you're talking about health, we now have a good understanding of the biological effects of chronic stress that leads to something like more rapid aging. And it changes physiological priorities, if you like, from things to do with health maintenance to fight and flight. And if you've got to deal with a short-term emergency, then all sorts of health functions, immunity, digestion, growth, reproductive functions, tissue maintenance and repair, all those things can be put on hold. When you're dealing with an emergency, that doesn't matter. But if you, as we do, go on worrying about things for weeks and months and years, then you get multiple health consequences. and the most powerful causes of stress seem to be things to do with social comparison, social status, social anxieties, as I say, our worries about ourselves. I think basically and one of the interesting things that's happened, the relationships which we published in the spirit level, often we are only able to make guesses at causality, sometimes from experiments on small groups of students or whatever. Now, again and again, we have international comparisons that show that we were right in the kinds of things, and that study of self-enhancement showed that it was a test of, explicitly a test of our theories in the spirit level, and that's happened a number of times. I was a student a very long time ago at the London School of Economics, and as well as doing economic history, I did courses with Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, and of course he said, how you distinguish between good and bad theories is the extent to which they make novel predictions that are then confirmed. And of course, our stuff has been tested repeatedly. When colleagues at Harvard first tested whether what I'd been talking about internationally, that inequality seems to lead to worse outcomes, they tested it amongst the American states. I'm glad I didn't know they were testing it until they'd finished, because at that stage I would have been very worried. But also papers dealing with the mechanisms. And of course, if there's a causal relationship, there must be the mechanism. So there's been so much research that fits in with these things, and that research on consumerism, which is another form of self-enhancement. I have had periods in my career where I felt maybe I've got this whole thing wrong, and I should retract before I'm shot down by somebody else. But when Kate and I got together, she insisted that we did a review of all the literature, and we looked at nearly 200 research papers. And I became really confident then that it was basically right, and with the spirit level, I felt quite sure the overall framework was right. There may be little bits, maybe we'd got wrong, but the basic framework, too much fits to be wrong.
One very interesting chapter in your book is called The Misconception of Meritocracy, and you quote Tory politician Boris Johnson, who has argued that some people are simply too stupid to catch up with the rest of society. And you, on the other hand, argue that class is not genetic. Something I find very frightening is the fact that a lot of people actually seem to believe this, that our place in society is determined by our genes. Well, you argue that this is not the case, but even if that was the case, would that really make inequality fair? Because the genes we're born with are just a coincidence. No one has earned them.
No, I agree.
So is this really meritocracy?
It's used as a justification. It's a popular justification for social hierarchy, but it is easily faulted that you did nothing to get the genes you have. So even if they were right, which I don't think they are, it's not a good moral justification for inequality.
But could you, maybe you write a lot about the way that the brain is formed by experiences and by class, and could you explain a bit more how this works?
Well, it's quite complicated, and so I think it's better read, but I'll try and go through it. First, we have studies that show the actual amount of grey matter in children's heads is, it grows more slowly if you're in poverty. And it is affected by the length of time in poverty. So there are quite crude studies of that kind, using brain scans and so on, that tell us quite a lot. But I think most important to the way I look at it is the mismatch between the twin studies, apparently showing genetic evidence that IQ is powerfully genetically determined. And I can't remember his name, a New Zealander, who has shown that in countries all over the world, population IQ increases dramatically over time. So much so that the idea that we get stupider as we get older seems to be partly that if you were born earlier, generation earlier, you were born with a lower IQ. He actually says that we put on scientific spectacles and gives examples. It doesn't matter, but he shows that there are these enormous environmental influences on total population IQ, which completely mismatches the evidence that it's genetic. So the question is, how do you put together that picture of strong environmental influences with the genetic evidence? And the way that people seem to be moving towards is that the environment, and particularly the chosen environment that you choose, amplifies small genetic differences. And so the easiest example is if you're good at something that makes you good at reading. You're going to be good at that, you're going to enjoy it more, and you're going to concentrate on more academic stuff. Someone who's good at ball games, has that kind of judgment and so on, is going to enjoy playing football more, and is going to be selected for the school team, will get coaching and so on. And so small genetic differences get amplified. They get bigger over time. We know that there are amplification effects of small genetic advantages from a quite different source. So, for instance, there are now a lot of studies that show if you're born nearer the beginning of the school year, you do better in all sorts of ways. You're more likely to take on leadership roles. You're more likely to be in the sports team. You do better in academic performance. And that is because you are a few months older than the average child in your class. You have that small biological advantage simply because of when your birthday is. And we see the same kind of amplification of that advantage through the chosen environment, as I'm suggesting happens with any small genetic advantage. But most important is that basically we get good at whatever we do. And whether that is bricklaying, and bricklaying isn't by any means an easy task. I was watching a house being built opposite my study window, and really, I wish I had the slide here. Extraordinarily good calculations of when he'd need to start this pattern to get his bricks lined up in a particular way and complete this pattern on the gable end. And I was really impressed with the skill, and I went up to him and said, you know, I was watching you, I really admired that. He said, yeah, it's the first time I've done it, and I only had this little angle thing to use. I didn't have a proper big one. And of course, the people who think that they're so much cleverer than people doing manual jobs, if they had to do those jobs, they wouldn't be any better at it. The evidence shows that, and taxi drivers, we spend quite a bit of discussing evidence like London taxi drivers. You know, they have to do exams to show that they know where all the streets are and how to get to them. The part of their brains that deal with spatial stuff actually gets bigger. We know that if you learn another language, you can see the effects on brain areas dealing with different things. If you learn to dance, if you learn a musical instrument. Now we have brain scans, we can actually see the physiological effects on the brain of doing these things. So I think that the causality between social status and IQ has been misunderstood. I also think, and I suppose what made me suspicious from the beginning, is that if there was something that made us all better at almost any task, as IQ is opposed to, then evolution would make sure we all have it. And binocular vision is an advantage. It helps us with judging distance. And that means we all have it. It's not something, you know, half of us still have just one eye, and all the others have two. and so it seems to me inherently unlikely that if there is a big genetic IQ factor, that we don't all, it hasn't become common throughout the population. And as I said, the things I've been telling you about in a chapter in the book point that direction.
Well, you briefly discussed some of the policy suggestions that you have to increasing equality. As I understand it, one of them deals with, you know, the question of economic growth. You write in your book that economic growth no longer improves well-being in the rich countries. You also stress the enormous challenge of climate change, which is strongly connected to our way of creating economic growth. And one suggestion you make is to turn higher productivity into fewer working hours, which would make the economy grow slower or not at all. And yet there is strong evidence that redistribution is very hard in a situation with no growth. For example,
it's hard
in a situation with no growth.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Thaler, the Nobel laureate, has shown that you know, how strongly people dislike parting from something that belongs to them. And I would argue that the high level of redistribution in Sweden was created in a situation of exceptionally high growth in the second half of the 20th century. Everyone gained something. Redistribution was not a zero-sum game. So isn't there a contradiction here? Would equality really improve in a situation with zero economic growth?
Well, I think what's behind that argument is the idea that maybe if you just stop top people's income growing, that gradually the rest of us will catch up and the differences will reduce. And I suppose that's an easier way of doing it. It doesn't mean actually taking more money from the rich. But the very big reductions in inequality associated with the New Deal in the 1930s, in one of those graphs I showed, I think that they became possible, and indeed Roosevelt pushed them, saying we need to reform in order to preserve the system. James Scott, an anthropologist and I think political scientist at Yale, says that it wasn't the statistics on unemployment and low wages that led to change in the New Deal in the 1930s. It was the riots, the wildcat strikes, the social disorder, which he says put the fear of God into them. And endlessly, historians tell us that, you know, whether it's improvements in the position of women, or the big electoral reforms, the extension of the franchise, issues to do with workers' rights, that actually they've come about from protest and being fought for and so on. Interestingly, there's now a rather good scientific study showing that demonstrations actually increase support, including voting support for the cause that is being people are demonstrating on. It has rather, I won't go into it, rather clever technique for assessing so it doesn't just show that, I don't know, people are more left or progressive in societies where there are bigger demonstrations.
It shows that support increases more when there are big demonstrations and less where there are smaller ones. And I'm getting into dangerous ground because it's difficult methodology, but it's a very good paper, which has convinced me that we need more protest, we need more demonstrations. As I say, books and statistics don't really do it. I will have failed unless you people demonstrate more.
Well, as I understand it, you argue that higher equality benefits almost everyone. But if this really is the case, how come we're not seeing everyone asking for more equality? And why is not everyone voting for left-wing parties? It seems like fewer people are voting for left-wing parties as income inequality increases.
Because people are so motivated in an unequal society by the desire for status. I've already quoted in interviews today Polly Toynbee, a Guardian journalist, who said she was interviewing some super-rich bankers, and she said to them, "You can't really spend all this money you're getting, millions of pounds, so what's it for?" And he answered, "It shows me I'm better than the next man." And, you know, these concerns about status and status competition go all the way up. Very good person on that is the economist at Cornell, Robert Frank. Books like Falling Behind and Luxury Fever. But, you know, and as I showed in those graphs of status anxiety, it's all income groups that are affected.
Well, thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Thank you.
Ja, thank you very much, Richard Wilkinson. Och tack alla ni som kom hit. Och här har vi ju fått en del råd vad vi ska syssla med framöver. Vi ska slåss för ekonomisk demokrati, vi ska organisera oss och vi ska protestera. Och det kan vi göra i våra fackföreningar, i våra politiska organisationer, i miljöorganisationer. Så det är upp till oss att ändra på den här världen. Tack för idag.